Angel had never broken protocol in 3 years of service. Not once. Not even during chaotic customs raids or tense standoffs in secondary screening rooms. But that night at San Francisco International Airport's Terminal G, everything changed. In one breathless moment that would rip apart the illusion of routine and expose a story no one was ready for. The fluorescent lights cast long reflections across the polished floor as exhausted passengers from Seoul's late arrival shuffled through customs. And Officer Ethan Mercer stood at his usual post, his hand resting loosely on the harness of his sleek canine partner, a Belgian Malinois named Angel, her coat a blend of caramel and black with intelligent amber eyes that scanned the crowd with quiet precision, not just sniffing for contraband like most dogs, but sensing tension, micro-expressions, posture, the invisible cracks in a person's performance, the signs that someone was hiding something and hoped no one would notice. She had been abandoned once, as a stray near the Arizona border, overlooked by other handlers for her lack of pedigree, until Mercer, a former Marine with a titanium rod in his leg and a second chance at purpose, saw something no one else did, a rare, instinctual intelligence that couldn't be taught. And over 3 years together, she had proven him right again and again. Until now, when she suddenly jerked her head toward a woman pushing a navy blue baby stroller, her posture stiffening, like a coiled spring as her ears snapped forward, tail low and tense. Before Mercer could react, Angel lunged, dragging him several feet and crashing her front paws against the edge of the stroller as the woman let out a piercing scream, stumbling backward, knocking over her shoulder bag as gasps rippled through. The terminal and passengers scattered, someone shouting, "Gun!" just as the blue baby blanket slid from the stroller, revealing not only a fussy, red-faced infant, but also something metallic glinting beneath the padding that made Mercer's stomach drop into ice water. "Step back! Everyone down!" he barked, pulling Angel away as security personnel surged forward, their hands hovering near holsters, the terminal erupting into motion, and all Mercer could see was the wide, terrified eyes of the baby and the pale, shaking face of the woman who had gone from anxious traveler to suspect in half a heartbeat. The weapon, a Glock 19, loaded, safety off, was wedged under the baby's seat, wrapped in a diaper liner, and for a full beat, Mercer couldn't understand what the hell he was seeing. Because who hides a loaded gun beneath a baby unless they're planning something catastrophic? And yet when he looked at the woman, dark, shoulder-length hair damp with sweat, eyes bloodshot and frantic, wearing jeans, a grey hoodie, and a gold cross around her neck, he didn't see a terrorist or a smuggler. He saw something broken, desperate, something that made Angel plant her feet and whine low in her throat. A sound Mercer knew meant the dog sensed something deeper than a threat, something human, something painful. "She's not backing off," he muttered to himself, as Angel refused the command to heel, her body rigid, nose pointed at the stroller, her entire focus unshakable. And when the woman cried out, "He had nothing to do with this," her voice cracking in anguish, Mercer's instincts kicked in, not just as a handler or officer, but as someone who'd seen enough to know when a person was bluffing and when they were trying not to shatter. They escorted her, Melissa Chen, according to the passport, into a secondary screening room. And Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up, especially when she resisted handing over the baby to another officer, clutching him like a lifeline, her whole body shaking, whispering, "Please don't take him," in a tone that felt less like defiance and more like pleading for protection. Angel paced outside the room, uneasy, still fixated on the stroller even after the weapon had been removed, her tail flicking in short, agitated bursts. And Mercer knew, he knew, that something else was buried beneath the surface, because Angel didn't bark like that for drugs or cash or fruit. And she didn't disobey unless she sensed danger beyond metal and powder. As Garcia, Mercer's supervisor, tried to calm the woman and take her statement, Mercer reviewed the security footage again and again. The moment Angel had picked up the scent, the way Melissa had tried to move away, her white-knuckled grip on the stroller handle, her overcompensation in answering simple questions, her refusal to let go of the infant, and it all painted a picture that didn't quite match what they were seeing on the surface. "You're not a criminal," Mercer found himself thinking as he stood in the doorway, watching her rock the baby, who had finally stopped crying and now dozed in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythmic, exhausted breaths, his onesie damp with sweat and his small fists curled against his mother's collarbone. And something about the sight made Mercer's throat tighten, because this wasn't what smugglers looked like, and yet a loaded weapon had been found inches from that child's spine. What kind of horror drives someone to make that decision? And as Angel settled finally at Mercer's feet, her eyes still tracking the infant with silent concern, Mercer felt the full weight of the moment descend on him. This wasn't about policy or detection numbers or even weapons charges. This was something else entirely. Something human. Something maternal and terrified. And when Melissa looked up at him through tear-swollen eyes and said, "Please, don't let him find us," he realized that whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be about enforcing the law. It was going to be about understanding why a woman would risk everything, even her baby's safety, to flee whatever waited. Behind her, and as the camera zooms out on the still trembling mother, the sleeping infant, the sleek dog whose instincts had cracked this story wide open, and the officer now caught in the middle, the only question that matters lingers in the air. What was she running from? And how far would she go to protect her child? Angel stayed alert beside Mercer as the door to secondary room 3 clicked shut behind them. The quiet hum of the overhead fluorescent lights mixing with the muffled cries of the baby as Melissa Chen cradled him in her lap, rocking gently on the metal bench with eyes so wide they seemed to reflect every sharp corner of the sterile room, her fingers twitching in nervous circles on the baby's back, her breath shallow and uneven, like every exhale was a risk she wasn't sure she could take. And Mercer remained silent at first, giving her space, letting the thick quiet stretch as Angel lay near the stroller, the same one that had cradled both a crying infant and a loaded Glock 19 with the safety off just moments earlier. Her nose, twitching slightly, ears tilted back, still locked into something beyond scent. Some instinct Mercer had learned never to question, not after 3 years of watching her detect things humans couldn't begin to name. He sat down slowly, the chair screeching slightly against the tile floor, hands visible, open, notepad untouched, and said in a low, steady voice that barely disturbed the air, "He's okay for now, Melissa. Your baby's okay. But I need to understand why that weapon was in the stroller, why you didn't say anything when we asked, and what exactly you're running from." And at that, her chin lifted slightly, lips parting like she wanted to scream but had forgotten how, and she whispered, "You wouldn't believe me." Her voice cracked like brittle porcelain, barely holding together, and Mercer leaned in just a fraction. "Try me," he said, and that tiny prompt broke something loose in her. The first breath she took afterward sounded more like a sob inhaled too fast, a gasp turned inside out, and she shook her head as her hand slid up to the gold cross necklace at her throat, fingers fumbling with the clasp until it came away, and she laid it on the table with trembling care, twisting it once until a tiny hinge clicked and the bottom of the cross popped open, revealing a thin micro USB drive nestled in the hollow chamber, its brushed silver surface catching the overhead light like a flare in the dark. And when Mercer raised a brow, she said, "Everything's on there. Why I ran, who he is, what he's capable of." And her eyes dropped to her son's now peaceful face. "I didn't smuggle anything to hurt people. I smuggled a weapon because I knew he would find me." And for a long moment, Mercer didn't speak, only reached into his pocket and pulled out a small evidence envelope, carefully placing the cross inside, sealing it without a sound before, turning his attention fully to the woman in front of him. Messy hair, sweat-slicked skin, clothes that hung too loose across her frame, like they had been bought for someone healthier, someone who still ate and slept and hoped like a regular human being. And when he spoke, his voice was just slightly above a whisper. "Tell me about him." And her mouth moved before any sound came out, like her body was remembering how to form truth in real time. And finally she said, "Robert Keller. He was my husband." And then the words began to spill, not in clean paragraphs, but in fragments, jagged edges of memory sliced into speech. We met in Seattle 4 years ago. I was doing contract work for a language software company, translation mostly, Korean, Mandarin, a little Japanese. He ran a private security firm, something sleek, clean suits, black cars, high-paying clients, bodyguards for tech execs and foreign dignitaries, and he looked like everything I thought stability was supposed to be. Calm, smart, charming in a way that felt expensive, and I hadn't dated seriously in years, too focused on work and moving out of my parents' shadow. But he made it feel easy, made me feel seen. She swallowed, blinked slowly, and then it changed, almost overnight, like he flipped a switch. First it was small. He'd correct my schedule, say I forgot things I hadn't, questioned if I'd eaten, if I'd spoken to my mother, told me certain friends weren't good influences, and when I pushed back, he'd apologize, say it was just him being protective, that I wasn't used to someone taking care of me. Her eyes darted to Mercer's for the first time, and her mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile in a kinder world. Then one night I came home and he'd gone through my phone. Every message, every call, said it was for my safety, that people were lying to me, that I didn't know how to judge character. I should have left then, I know that now. But I didn't, because by then he'd already cut me off from my family, moved me into a new place under his name, and he kept saying he loved me, that I was his. Her voice broke again. That I was lucky, and Mercer's jaw tensed because the pattern was too familiar, too real. And she continued. The first time he hit me, I was late coming home from the grocery store, 10 minutes late, and he said it made him feel abandoned. Her hand went to a faint scar at her temple, partially hidden under her hairline. He said if I just followed the rules, I'd never have to feel pain again. And after that it got worse. She looked down at Benjamin, sleeping still, his tiny lips moving in dreams. When I found out I was pregnant, I told myself it would change him, that maybe a child would fix whatever was broken in him, make him soften. But instead, he turned the pregnancy into a prison. He monitored every appointment, tracked every calorie, had cameras in every room of the apartment including the nursery, and when Benjamin was born, her voice faltered again. He never held him, never changed a diaper, just used him to keep me there. Said if I left, no one would believe I was fit to raise a child, that he had friends in ICE who could have me deported even though I was naturalized, that he could make me disappear. She fell silent then, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her hoodie, and Mercer spoke softly. Is that why you altered his birth documents? And she nodded, slow and heavy. I changed the dates, the passport, everything. I used my old Korean ID to create a false entry log, told customs we were visiting relatives in Seoul, when really I was just trying to hide. My parents are in Seoul, elderly. They helped me buy the tickets in cash, told me not to come, said I was being followed, but I had nowhere else to go. My visa was expiring. I couldn't stay in Korea, and I couldn't return home because Robert would find me, and if he found us, he'd take Benjamin, and I'd never see him again. Mercer stayed very still, aware of the weight of every detail, stacking up like bricks in a wall meant to cage her in. And the gun? He asked again, and her head dropped, chin to chest. I stole it from his lockbox, one of a dozen he kept around the house, Glock 19. I knew how to use it, he made me train at the range with him when we first got married. Said he wanted a wife who could handle herself, but really, he just wanted to control every part of me. She lifted her head again. I couldn't leave the gun with my parents, couldn't put it in checked luggage, so I wrapped it in the stroller, where I thought it would be safest. Not safest for Benjamin, she added quickly, tears returning, but safest from discovery. Robert never once pushed that stroller, never touched the baby's things, said all of it was women's work. He would never have checked there if he caught up to us. And in that moment, Mercer saw her, not just as a woman or a mother, but as a tactician, someone who had been forced to plan every breath, every blink, every exit route like her life depended on it. Because it had, and as Powell entered the room with a laptop and plugged in the USB, Mercer watched her jaw tighten and her hands clench, like someone waiting to be sentenced. But Powell only gave a slight nod as the first video file loaded, a time-stamped clip from a security camera showing Robert shoving Melissa into a wall while holding a wine bottle in one hand, her face flinching even before the impact. And Mercer had to look away for a beat before forcing himself back to stillness, back to composure as Powell skipped through more files, hospital scans, x-rays, financial ledgers showing Melissa's accounts being drained, even call logs where Robert threatened legal action if she missed a feeding schedule by 10 minutes. And every click was another nail in the coffin of doubt, each document a brutal echo of the truth they were now drowning in. And by the time Powell shut the laptop and nodded again, Melissa looked so small in the chair, it was like she'd folded into herself. "We'll verify all of this," Powell said gently. "But if it checks out the way it looks, you won't be charged for trafficking. We'll advocate for special consideration." And Melissa just nodded, silent, holding Benjamin close again, burying her face in his hair. And Mercer stood, rubbing Angel's head, his thoughts racing with the implications, not just for Melissa, but for Robert Keller, a man whose power had shielded him for years, who had likely done this before, who now had a target on his back. He wouldn't see coming, and as they began coordinating with victim advocates and immigration lawyers and local law enforcement in Seattle, Mercer couldn't help but feel that something had shifted irreversibly, not just in Melissa's life, but in his own. The law was one thing, but justice, real justice, was messy, painful, slow, and often hid in places no one wanted to search, like beneath a baby's seat in a crowded airport. And as they walked, her and Benjamin, to temporary housing, secure, anonymous, guarded, Mercer stayed just a few steps behind, Angel at his side, and for a moment, as Melissa looked back over her shoulder with a gaze not of fear but cautious relief, Mercer understood what Angel had known all along. This woman wasn't hiding a crime. She was hiding from one. The days that followed the safe house breach alert were not measured in hours, but in stress cycles, monitoring, reinforcing, reassessing, then starting over, as Mercer operated in a state of heightened awareness that had become second nature since his military discharge. Only now it wasn't a foreign desert or an enemy checkpoint, but suburban streets, rental cars with out-of-state plates, and couriers with too much eye contact that stirred the combat reflexes buried deep in his muscle memory. And while Angel rarely left his side, tethered invisibly by years of shared tension and trust, Melissa Chen sat in a borrowed armchair inside the converted fire station, clutching Benjamin to her chest, rocking gently while murmuring lullabies in Korean, her voice never rising above a whisper, as if the shadows still had ears. And Mercer would occasionally catch her staring blankly at the ceiling between verses, blinking slowly, the kind of blink that meant her brain was replaying old tapes on loop, every second a trigger, every memory still hot from trauma. But she never asked for pity or broke into sobs like some might expect. Instead, she stiffened, straightened, and refocused on Benjamin with the cold, precise resolve of a woman who had decided that whatever came next, she would not let her child be taken, even if it meant not surviving herself. The agents from Homeland Security rotated in and out with quiet efficiency, each shift leaving behind new encrypted tablets, burner phones, voice scramblers. But it was Mercer who remained the constant, watchful, steady, and slowly becoming more than just the officer assigned to escort a witness. He became their shield, their interpreter in the language of institutional fear. And as the days ticked by without a single credible lead on Robert Keller's location, the sense of control they had begun to feel after seizing his encrypted laptop began to rot at the edges, because Keller wasn't just hiding, he was preparing, and that was worse. Powell's briefings became longer, more coded, delivered at night by courier with thumbprint verification, before Mercer would plug in a tablet and read the day's update under low light, with Angel sitting upright, watching the door, and it was through one of those reports that he learned of Keller's silent financial shell accounts being drained in precise amounts, $4,500 here, $3,200 there, from prepaid cards issued to names that didn't exist, used in states they hadn't, flagged, and always one step behind them, and it clicked for Mercer then. Keller wasn't just running. He was staging a Stage 2 maneuver, re-establishing control from the shadows, rebuilding his ghost network piece by piece. And he was doing it all while they waited for warrants, confirmations, legal assurances that the system hadn't yet been compromised. But Mercer had been a soldier long enough to know that some battles don't wait for orders. They simply arrive. And in the end, they found Keller not through surveillance, but through silence. A hole in the digital chatter, where noise should have been, when a known burner phone last used by his head of security pinged a tower in Redmond, Washington, before going dark, and the tower logs showed a 12-minute call from an internal building on a private tech campus, listed under a shell company flagged in one of Keller's financial logs. And when agents arrived hours later, they found a glass office filled with overturned desks and a single camera still recording, facing the wall, and on the floor lay a note in Sharpie. "That wasn't me," which Powell read aloud before, tossing the paper aside and muttering, "He's mocking us now." And she wasn't wrong, because a day later, a video surfaced on a back-channel Telegram group showing grainy footage of Melissa crossing the Seoul airport gate. Benjamin swaddled to her chest, the caption written in code but easily translated. "Package moved, trace the return." Mercer saw red when he watched it, not from anger alone, but from a building dread that Keller was now trying to incite someone else to do the work for him. To make Melissa a target not just of his vengeance, but of the black web's curiosity, the same one that feeds on missing persons, revenge porn, and bodycam leaks for entertainment. And Mercer stormed into Powell's field office, demanding upgraded protection, faster extradition protocols, and full clearance to install biometric locks on the safehouse exits, because what had started as a smuggling incident was now boiling into the edges of domestic terrorism. And yet, all the while, Melissa remained a statue, unflinching, unshakable in the face of endless fear. And Benjamin, perhaps sensing the storm around him, began to sleep in longer bursts, clinging to Angel's flank like a puppy to its mother. And Mercer, watching them curled up together during a particularly loud thunderstorm, felt something shift inside him. A responsibility deeper than duty, sharper than law. And when Melissa turned to him that night and asked, "What happens if he gets past all of it?" he didn't offer protocol or promises. He simply said he won't, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything before. A week later, Powell authorized a preemptive strike, a coordinated set of raids across multiple properties still registered to Keller's aliases, including an abandoned vineyard in eastern Oregon, where they found half-burned documents, a locked safe containing unregistered firearms, and a list of phone numbers that led to burner accounts pinging towers in both Canada and Thailand. And from that list emerged a name, Arman Velasquez, a suspected logistics broker tied to Keller's firm who had evaded capture 3 times in the last 6 years, and now he had resurfaced in a condo in San Diego, photographed entering the building with a woman holding a red folder, her face obscured by a hood. And when Mercer saw the still, his heart stopped. The woman wasn't Melissa, but she had her build, her gait, and Benjamin's same blue blanket slung over one shoulder like a makeshift burp rag, and it hit him like a bullet. Keller wasn't hunting Melissa anymore. He was preparing to replace her, to stage her, to use her as a false flag in a narrative that would give him justification to claim custody, to appear in court if necessary, and say he believed she'd died or gone underground, and then walk away with the child as the grieving, noble father, unless someone stopped him first. And Mercer, reading between the lines of Powell's next memo, knew she was ready to do just that. Within 72 hours, the DOJ issued a full asset freeze on Keller's remaining known properties, flagged every alias tied to his former firm, and began the process of officially charging him in absentia with conspiracy, abuse, firearms violations, and child endangerment. But they still hadn't found him, not fully, not in the way that mattered. And as Mercer drove back to the safe house under cover of darkness, Angel riding shotgun now, with her eyes trained on the side mirrors, he found himself gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, because the story was unraveling too slowly, the system too methodical, while Keller's moves were swift, efficient, and deadly quiet. And when he arrived, he found the safe house darker than usual. The lights dimmed under blackout orders, and Melissa waiting in the hallway with Benjamin already strapped into a carrier, a go bag at her feet, her eyes saying it before her mouth did. Something's wrong, moral. And then the backup generator kicked on without prompt, the first clue that someone had tampered with the grid, and Angel growled, low and deep, her body coiled like a wire about to snap, and Mercer pulled his weapon from his holster, sweeping the hallway with his free hand as he moved to the control panel, verifying that the primary feed had been disconnected manually. And when he saw the signature of the override, 6 digits entered in under 4 seconds, he knew only someone with access could have done it, and Powell's face on the tablet seconds later confirmed it. "One of our own flipped," she said, breathless, audio glitching slightly. "Stay put, we're coming to you. Don't trust anyone outside your perimeter." And Mercer turned to Melissa, already ushering her toward the panic room, Benjamin wide-eyed but silent, and Angel circling them protectively, as Mercer sealed the outer hall door and keyed in a manual lock sequence only 2 agents had access to, one of whom had been killed in a car crash 2 days prior, a crash now looking less like an accident and more like prelude. The next 2 hours passed in a haze of held breath, low murmurs, and gunmetal readiness. Angel stationed at the base of the panic room's steel vault, her body rigid, tail low, a single warning bark echoing once when a door creaked near the stairwell, and then silence again until Powell's voice returned over the scrambled comms. "You're green. Come out slowly." And Mercer did, weapon drawn, sweeping the main room before signaling Melissa to follow. And when they emerged, Powell was standing in the kitchen, flanked by 2 agents Mercer didn't recognize, all 3 wearing tactical vests and grim expressions. And behind them, the hallway wall was stained with something dark. Gunfire had broken through during the approach. Someone had tried to breach early, but been stopped before crossing the threshold, and Powell nodded toward the rear door. "We got him. Velasquez, not Keller. But it's a start." And Mercer exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. They relocated that night, again, this time to a federal compound used for witness relocation debriefings. And Melissa was issued a new name, a new background, and for the first time since their journey began, a vague but visible path forward. Yet even as the sun rose over the compound, casting soft light across the barrack-style windows and long gravel pathways, Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That Keller, wherever he was still watching, still waiting, and Angel seemed to agree, her eyes locked on the perimeter fence long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The compound was quiet, almost eerily so, the kind of engineered silence that came not from peace, but from planning, from federal design meant to calm the body while keeping the mind alert, with motion sensors buried under gravel walkways, reinforced concrete disguised by wooden siding, and no identifiable markers for what it really was: a fortress, a vault, a final resort for people like Melissa Chen and her infant son, for survivors who had seen too much, heard too much, and carried evidence capable of blowing open systems, meant to stay hidden forever, and Mercer could feel it in the way the guards moved, not just with duty, but with unease, like they knew a storm was still coming. Even as the DOJ issued indictments, and the press began nibbling around the edges of Keller's unraveling empire, publishing sanitized headlines about alleged abuses and unnamed whistleblowers, while omitting what everyone on the inside already knew, that Melissa's testimony and the files from her USB drive had exposed not only domestic terror, but an ecosystem of exploitation, surveillance, and erasure built on decades of unchecked privilege and weaponized connections. And yet Robert Keller remained at large, an absence so loud it echoed through every closed door and back hallway, his name spoken less like a suspect and more like a ghost you didn't want to wake. And inside that compound, Melissa barely spoke now unless asked, not from fear, but because her words were being saved, stored up like ammunition for the courtroom, for the day when her voice would be weaponized legally and publicly against the man who once promised to love her. And Benjamin had stopped fussing. As often, perhaps sensing that movement meant danger, that silence was safer, and he often lay quietly in his portable bassinet beside Angel, who had taken on the role of full-time guardian, her eyes rarely closing for more than a few seconds, her body curling instinctively whenever the baby shifted, and Mercer watched it all unfold like a slow-burning fuse, knowing they were in the middle of something historic and horrifying all at once. Because while most agents marked success by arrests and case closures, this was different. This was a survival narrative unfolding in real time, and its ending had not yet been written. Powell arrived every morning like clockwork, her hair always tied back tight, phone always in hand, eyes scanning briefing folders before she spoke, her presence equal parts comforting and unrelenting. And it was on a Tuesday, 10 days after the last relocation, that she called Mercer into the comms room and showed him a series of stills, grainy black and whites, from a roadside surveillance unit 2 states away. A figure stepping out of a rental car, tall, broad-shouldered, baseball, cap low over his face, carrying what looked like a hard case, and though no one said the name, they all knew who it was. Robert Keller had resurfaced, and not in hiding but in motion, like a shark circling its prey, and Powell leaned forward, voice low, clipped. He's moving faster than we expected, and he's dropping breadcrumbs, which means he's either panicking or planning a spectacle, and Mercer knew Keller well enough by now to bet on the latter, and his gut confirmed it when the next piece of intel came in. A voicemail left on the emergency hotline of a Seattle-based domestic abuse shelter, traced back to a disposable phone purchased 48 hours prior, a male voice layered with static saying, "You're protecting someone who doesn't deserve it," followed by coordinates leading not to a location, but to a gravestone, an empty plot purchased 6 years ago in Melissa's maiden name. And Mercer felt the temperature drop around them as they processed it. Not because it was a threat, but because it was a declaration. Keller wasn't coming to kill her. He was coming to erase her, to replace her reality with his version. And unless they caught him first, he would succeed, because power like his didn't rely on bullets. It relied on narrative. And Mercer, already pacing, already feeling the tug of combat readiness waking in his bones, said, "We need to flip this, make him come to us." And Powell, to her credit, didn't flinch, didn't push back, just nodded once and opened her phone to begin typing a classified directive. What followed next was a dance Mercer never wanted to choreograph again. A staged transfer of Melissa and Benjamin to a decoy safe house on paper, complete with falsified transport manifests, social media leaks, and planted airport security footage, showing a woman resembling Melissa boarding a flight under a government ID, and it worked. The trap was laid, and Keller bit, because 3 days later, a man in a black hoodie tried to breach the decoy site, armed with a keycard stolen from a former contractor on Keller's payroll, and he didn't make it 3 feet past the security gate before being neutralized. But that wasn't the victory. It was what they found in his boot, taped inside a hollowed-out insole, a USB with blueprints of the compound Melissa had been moved from 2 weeks earlier, which confirmed Mercer's worst fear, that they were always just one step ahead of an enemy who knew the system better than they did, because he had helped design it. Back at the real compound, Melissa sat stone-faced as Powell relayed the details, and then without being asked, she stood, walked to her go-bag, and pulled out a notebook, handwritten, bent at the spine, pages smudged with formula and fingerprints, and laid it on the table in front of Mercer, saying, "He used to talk in his sleep." And inside were pages of fragmented phrases, names, dates, partial email strings, references to secure meetups and account numbers, things Melissa had written in code over the course of 3 years because she couldn't record anything digitally without Keller finding out. And it was that notebook, not the encrypted laptop, not the surveillance logs, but Melissa's hand-penned journal, that cracked the case open finally, because within it was a phrase repeated across several entries. Trinity Line, a term not found in any database until Powell's tech analyst discovered it buried inside a private server registered under a firm specializing in family reunification services, operating out of an abandoned resort in southern Utah. And suddenly, Everything clicked. Keller's vanishing act, the silence, the false flag operations, the photos, the fake identities, they were all part of a deeper network, a pipeline not just for abuse cover-ups, but for international movement of women and children under aliases, a laundering operation for human lives disguised as domestic rehabilitation. And Melissa had been slated as their next permanent erasure, a case they could file away as resolved while Keller moved on with a new name, a different passport, and a claim to his son backed by forged documents and digital manipulations. And Powell said what they were all thinking. We've been chasing a single criminal when this has always been a system. And the air left. The room like a vacuum as Mercer stood slowly, eyes already scanning the wall for maps, for connections, for targets. They moved fast this time. Warrants, raids, coordinated arrests across 6 states. And though not everyone involved could be detained immediately, the blowback was seismic. Keller's financial empire frozen entirely, his partners exposed, dozens of employees resigning publicly, and best of all, a hard drive recovered from the Utah facility showing records of false birth certificates, altered hospital records, and transit schedules for off-the-grid medical procedures, all damning, all admissible. And Melissa's name appeared 4 times on different lists with 4 different fates. 2 marked relocation complete, 1 marked missing, and 1, chillingly, marked reacquisition approved, which meant that Keller had filed an internal request to have her forcibly returned and re-indoctrinated into the program. And that was the moment everyone stopped using the word victim and started using the word target, because Melissa had never just escaped. She had defected. And now, for Keller's operation to survive, she had to be publicly discredited, permanently silenced, or both. Mercer didn't sleep after that, not really. And neither did Angel, who began shadowing Melissa's every movement, from the bathroom to the outdoor courtyard to the makeshift nursery where Benjamin now cooed at picture books and responded to his name. And Mercer, watching the boy's fingers curl around the stuffed bear he'd brought weeks earlier, felt something break loose in his chest, something tender and terrifying, because it had been years since he'd cared like this, since his service discharge left him angry and drifting. And now here he was guarding a woman who had taught herself to decode abuse, and a child who would one day learn that his mother didn't run from evil. She stared it down and dismantled it. The final piece came from an unlikely source, a whistleblower from inside Keller's old firm, someone who'd seen the indictments and reached out anonymously with GPS coordinates, saying only, "He's returning to Seattle to finish it." And when Powell verified the coordinates as a decommissioned observatory Keller had once used for training retreats, the trap was set again. But this time, Mercer was inside it, positioned with Angel on the inner catwalk, his rifle trained on, the lower platform where a single figure entered at 3:17 a.m., unarmed, hands raised, voice calm. "I knew you'd find me," Keller said. And when Mercer didn't respond, Keller stepped closer and smiled. "Did she tell you how she cried when I said I loved her? How she begged me to stay when I packed? My bags?" And Mercer tightened his grip slightly, finger hovering near the trigger. "You're done, Robert," he said, and Keller laughed softly. "No, officer, I've only just begun. You see, no matter what you charge me with, the world still believes the version I create." And Mercer replied, "Not anymore." And a moment later, agents stormed the entrance, and Keller dropped to his knees, cuffed and silent, the smirk still painted across his face. But Mercer wasn't watching anymore. He was already calling Powell, already driving back to the compound, because he knew Keller's arrest wouldn't feel real until he saw Melissa's face, until he could say, "You're safe," and believe it. And when he arrived and walked through the door, Benjamin reached for Angel, and Melissa turned slowly, eyes rimmed red, and whispered, "Is it over?" And Mercer, for the first time in weeks, nodded and said, "It's starting to be." And Angel, sensing the shift in energy, lay down at Benjamin's feet and closed her eyes. Mercer hadn't expected the quiet to be this loud after Keller's arrest, hadn't anticipated how silence could weigh heavier than sirens or screams. But the hours following that final takedown inside the abandoned Seattle observatory felt like the pressure drop before a storm, the way the air feels thinner charged, holding its breath while waiting for what comes next. Because capturing Keller was not the end. It was merely the opening move in a far more intricate and brutal game. The legal war, the public battle, the forensic unraveling of everything he had built and buried. And while Mercer filed reports and signed affidavits and fielded calls from journalists masked as distant sources, Melissa was moved once again, not for safety this time, but for strategy. Relocated to a federal staging facility equipped with a legal prep suite, trauma counselors, and a courtroom simulation chamber where she could practice testifying under controlled conditions, and while agents treated her like a high-priority asset, Mercer noticed the shift in her posture, shoulders tighter, voice flatter, the reappearance of that cautious stiffness he'd first seen when she clutched Benjamin at the airport and looked like she was made of wire about to snap. Because now that the monster had a face again, the real fear returned. Not that Keller would hurt her, but that the system wouldn't believe her, not fully, not in a way that mattered when the courtroom lights dimmed and the defense team sharpened their knives. And Mercer did his best to steady her, to remind her that truth was armor, and Angel was a shadow that never left her side. But even he could feel it, the shifting undercurrent of exhaustion and doubt that came after surviving something unthinkable and realizing the second half might be worse. Benjamin, now nearly 8 months old, had grown more vocal, babbling syllables that echoed down the compound halls and tugged smiles from agents who hadn't smiled in days. But Melissa rarely laughed anymore. Her expressions now rationed like currency, and she spent most of her time reviewing her testimony under dim lamplight, watching security footage from her old apartment, pausing, rewinding, fast-forwarding through moments that left her hand trembling, but her voice steady, because she wanted to memorize it all, not just for herself, but for the jury, for the prosecutors, for the truth that too many women before her never got to say out loud. Mercer, assigned to assist the federal legal team as both liaison and witness handler, spent most of his days moving between briefing rooms, legal prep sessions, and phone calls with Homeland and DOJ reps, now coordinating witness protection protocols. And while Powell remained the operation's brain, Mercer had become its spine, the one person who seemed able to hold everything together when exhaustion cracked the edges of their operation. And Angel, unshaken by the paperwork and politics, remained the quiet enforcer, a presence so constant that Melissa had stopped asking if she could stay and simply left space beside Benjamin's crib for her to curl up each night. Then came the first hearing, a preliminary evidentiary session to determine whether Keller would face trial in federal court or be granted a plea hearing under state jurisdiction. And while the prosecution came in prepared with files, charts, and timelines, the defense's approach was surgical, attacking Melissa's credibility, painting her as a mentally unstable mother who had falsified documents, crossed international borders illegally, and endangered her child with a loaded weapon. And Mercer sat there, fists clenched under the table, as the defense attorney, an immaculate man with a Harvard pedigree and a voice like silk over knives, used Melissa's fear against her, quoting her panicked customs interaction out of context, suggesting that her decision to hide the weapon proved paranoia rather than desperation. And when he played a slowed-down clip of Melissa shouting, "He doesn't know," at the airport, Mercer's pulse jumped, because he remembered that moment. The pain behind her voice, the broken edge of maternal instinct. And yet the courtroom heard it differently, more abstract, more surgical. And though the judge didn't rule against them, he didn't shut it down either. And afterward, Melissa sat in the prep room for 37 minutes without speaking, her eyes fixed on nothing, Benjamin asleep in her arms, and Mercer stood nearby, helpless, until finally she whispered, "They're trying to erase me." And he replied without hesitation, "Then we sharpen your story until it carves through steel." And that became their mantra. Over the next 3 weeks, the case bloomed into a national story. And while Melissa's name remained redacted in court filings, Keller's didn't, and headlines like "Security Tycoon Faces Child Abuse Allegations" and "Inside the Quiet," "War on Women," dominated feeds, triggering opinion columns, podcast exposés, and even death threats from Keller's loyalists who refused to believe their icon could fall so far. And Melissa, despite knowing it wasn't personal, felt every word like a dagger, and at night, she'd scroll through comment sections with her thumb shaking, showing Mercer anonymous posts calling her a liar, a whore, an opportunist, and he'd take the phone from her gently and say, "You don't have to carry their projections." But she would always answer, "They're carrying his voice," and he'd have no reply. Then came the real trial. The federal charges stacked into a tower of truth built from her files, her videos, her journal entries, and her voice, and Melissa testified for 8 hours across 3 days, never breaking, never stuttering, even when the defense tried to corner her into emotional spirals. And Mercer, seated 2 rows behind her with Angel at his feet, watched as she looked directly at Keller each time, as if refusing to let him look away. And by the time closing arguments arrived, even the defense seemed shaken by the mountain they had failed to climb. The verdict came fast, guilty on all primary counts, including interstate trafficking, weaponized coercion, and child endangerment. And while sentencing would come later, Melissa didn't cry when the judge read the decision. She simply exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath since the day she left Seoul. And that night, back at the compound, Mercer brought takeout and 3 sodas, and for the first time since the airport, Melissa laughed. Not loud, not long, but real. And Benjamin giggled. An Angel wagged her tail as if sensing the seismic shift in the air, and Mercer leaned against the doorframe watching them, and realized he wasn't just protecting them anymore. He was part of them, and for the first time since his deployment ended, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The next morning, Powell arrived with an envelope containing relocation details, new names, new identities, a new address in a state that would remain redacted even from Mercer's records. And Melissa read it all slowly, her fingers grazing. The new IDs, her eyes lingering on the new last name they'd chosen, Reynolds. And then she looked at Mercer and said, "Will he ever stop watching?" And Mercer replied, "He'll try, but you're out of reach now." And she nodded, folding the papers back into the envelope, and began packing their things. The goodbye was quiet. No speeches, no long hugs, just a nod between warriors who had survived something few people could understand. And as Melissa buckled Benjamin into his new car seat and clipped the leash onto Angel's harness, yes, she was taking her, had filed the adoption papers the moment the trial ended. Mercer simply said, "You did it," and she answered, "No, we did." And then they were gone. And Mercer stood in the empty hallway of the compound, feeling a silence that no longer felt heavy, but clean like snow. And he turned, ready to file one last report before heading home, and stopped when he saw what Melissa had left behind. The original bear he'd given Benjamin, now worn and faded, with a note tucked inside that read, "He sleeps with this every night. So should you." Mercer didn't go home the night Melissa left, not really. He went back to the empty compound where the lights hummed a little too loud, and the furniture looked suddenly smaller without Angel curled at the base of the couch or Benjamin's scattered toys on the floor, and he stood in the center of the main living room for what felt like an hour with his arms folded, the soft creak of his leather holster all that interrupted the silence. Because what do you do when the mission ends, but your hands won't unclench? When the enemy is behind bars, but your pulse is still tuned to alarms? When you've protected someone so fiercely that their absence feels like something vital is missing, like part of your chest was packed in the trunk of a black SUV and driven off under government escort? He thought about calling Powell just to hear something sharp and grounding, but instead he sat down and stared at the file folder Melissa had left behind, not her relocation file, that was already encrypted and destroyed, but the one labeled only with a single word in her handwriting: Aftermath. And inside were pages she hadn't been required to provide, pages of thoughts she said she wrote during the quiet nights between testimony prep and legal briefings, pages where she wondered what kind of man Benjamin would grow into, whether he'd ever know how close he came to being a pawn in his father's empire, or if someday he'd ask where the scars on his mother's back came from and she'd have to decide whether to tell him the truth or protect him from it. And Mercer read them all slowly, carefully, like sacred texts. And when he finished, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and realized that no amount of protective detail could insulate someone from memory. That you could build steel vaults and guard towers and legally erase names. But trauma was the one enemy that never slept. And that night he didn't sleep either, just sat awake until dawn, broke through the compound's reinforced blinds and bathed the walls in a dull grey light that made everything look like it had been underwater. The days after were filled with debriefs and signed statements and official closure. Words Mercer hated because they sounded like endings, and nothing about this felt finished. And Powell, always pragmatic, handed him his next assignment, a narcotics intel rotation in Arizona, and he took the folder without argument, but didn't open it, just tucked it into his jacket like a placeholder for a future he wasn't ready to start. And then came the headline: Former security CEO injured in prison attack, and Mercer's phone lit up before he could even finish reading the byline. Powell on the other end saying, "Don't celebrate too fast, he survived." And sure enough, the article detailed a stabbing in the federal holding unit, non-lethal, 2 cracked ribs, a punctured lung, but Keller was still alive and, according to unnamed sources, already talking to lawyers about a retrial on technical grounds, claiming mishandling of evidence and jury bias. And Mercer swore under his breath, because this was the part no one talks about. The part where monsters try to crawl back out of the grave using the very system they once corrupted. And while Powell assured him that the legal team was solid and no retrial would hold, Mercer felt the itch between his shoulders return. That old sixth sense that had kept him breathing through 3 combat tours and 2 cartel takedowns. The one that said something was coming. Something worse, because now Keller had nothing to lose. Melissa was never told about the prison attack, not officially, and Mercer didn't reach out, respecting the hard boundary of witness relocation. But he kept tabs in his own quiet ways, using contacts to monitor check-ins, coded updates, and one day a postcard arrived at his office with no return address, just a sketch of a dog, a baby, and a man standing beside them, all drawn in crayon, and 3 words: "Still with us." And Mercer kept it pinned inside his locker, right above his badge, as both a reminder and a promise. It should have ended there. It should have been over. But 5 months later, a Homeland analyst flagged a pattern. 3 separate women in 3 separate states, all checking into domestic abuse shelters using false names, all with children under 1-year-old, all claiming to be fleeing men affiliated with a Keller-type program. And while none of them knew Melissa or each other, the details were too aligned to ignore. Hidden cameras, financial monitoring, threats of court weaponization. And Mercer was flown to DC within 48 hours to review the files. His name now quietly attached to a special internal task force investigating legacy networks, operations that continued to function despite the incarceration of their architects. And when he read the 4th file, his blood ran cold, because the woman in question had used a term Melissa had once written in her Aftermath journal: emotional architecture, a phrase Keller used to describe the psychological map he'd designed to isolate and manipulate her. And Mercer knew then that someone was still teaching his playbook, still operationalizing abuse like a corporate strategy. And when Powell confirmed it with a single sentence, he made backups. Mercer asked to go back in, to go undercover, to do something because he couldn't sit behind a desk while women were being reprogrammed to believe they were unfit. Mothers and children were growing up with surveillance instead of lullabies. The request was approved, and within weeks, Mercer was embedded with a fictitious security consultancy in Chicago, rumored to be a recruiting front for Keller's protégés. And the world he entered felt like a mirror reflection of everything he'd just helped dismantle. Polished conference rooms, motivational posters, wellness programs that tracked employees' eating habits and bedtime routines, all under the guise of optimization. And it took him less than 3 days to identify the first link. A man named Grayson Shaw, late 30s, former operations director for one of Keller's shell firms, now consulting on digital risk mitigation, but really teaching new enforcers how to make their partners feel crazy without ever raising a hand. Mercer played the role perfectly. Quiet, observant, a little damaged, and Shaw took the bait, inviting him to a private weekend retreat under the firm's emotional integrity program. And what Mercer found there was a ranch house in upstate Illinois filled with smart TVs, biometric locks, and a training module labeled Family Stability Enforcement, videos, documents, scripts for gaslighting, step-by-step guides on how to control a household through doubt and dependency, and he downloaded everything, burned it to 3 separate encrypted drives, and flew back to DC under the pretense of a family emergency, handing the data to Powell, who turned pale halfway through the first folder and whispered, "It's bigger than we thought." And just like that, the case reopened. Not against Keller, but against the legacy he had seeded like a virus, and Mercer found himself not just back in the game, but deeper than ever. This time, without Melissa at his side, without Angel to read the shifts in the room, just his own instincts, and the ghost of a promise he'd made to a mother who had trusted him to end this once and for all. The task force expanded, agents were embedded, and a full federal review was launched under the radar. But Keller, despite his wounds and confinement, kept sending messages, smuggled letters, legal memos, statements through third parties, all coded, all designed to paint himself as the victim of a witch hunt. And some of them began surfacing in fringe media circles, blogs that accused Melissa of being a plant, a psychological manipulator who seduced her way into federal protection, and Mercer nearly broke his desk in half when one article used the phrase weaponized motherhood to describe her trial testimony, and Powell issued a gag order on all team members interacting with the press. But Mercer kept copies of every slanderous headline, every twisted quote, because someday Benjamin would ask what the world said about his mother, and Mercer wanted to show him the lies and then the truth. Wanted to say, they tried to erase her, but we wrote her back into history. And when another file landed, on his desk weeks later, an intercepted message outlining a plan to discredit key witnesses in Keller's trial, Mercer didn't hesitate, didn't pause, just stood and said, "Give me a name." And what he got was a man in Phoenix pretending to be a trauma counselor, feeding his patients scripts about forgiveness and reconciliation. And Mercer flew out that night, posed as a struggling veteran with a custody case, and within 20 minutes had enough recordings to shut the operation down. But when he exited the building and sat in the rental car, his hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear, but from rage, because it was happening all over again. The manipulation, the erasure, the quiet grooming of women into silence. And he called Powell and said, "We need to bring her back." And Powell said, "She's protected." And Mercer said, "She's proof." And Powell paused, then asked, "Do you think she'd testify again?" And Mercer, heart hammering, said, "She shouldn't have to, but I think she will." And that night, alone in his motel room, he pulled out the old sketch postcard from his wallet and whispered, "I need your voice again." And across the country, inside a 2-bedroom rental with a false name on the mailbox, Melissa woke from a dream she couldn't remember, went to check on Benjamin, and found Angel already there, ears perked, watching the window, like she knew something was coming. Melissa stood motionless in the small living room of the rental home she now called her own, though it didn't feel like ownership. More like borrowed peace, like the quiet was on lease and could be reclaimed at any moment by a force she thought she had escaped. And as the wind stirred the curtains that hung stiff and beige across the windows, Angel let out a soft whine near the threshold, her body alert, not in fear, but recognition. The same way she had stiffened the day they first met, the day everything changed, and Melissa crossed the floor slowly, gently patting the dog's head before stepping outside into the sunlight that felt too bright, too clean, like it didn't belong in the same world as the memory that had just come uninvited into her sleep. A memory of concrete rooms, cold voices, and the sound of her own breath coming too fast, as Keller whispered something she couldn't now recall, but could still feel under her skin. Benjamin was still asleep in the next room, curled beside a window that overlooked a backyard lined with red bark mulch and artificial grass. And she couldn't help but think how strange it was that something fake could feel safer than anything real ever had. And she closed the door behind her just as a soft knock came from the front. 3 taps, then 2, and her stomach dropped, because that knock had been rehearsed, taught to her by Powell months ago as part of the emergency recontact protocol. And when she opened the door, her breath caught, not at the sight of the agent beside the porch column, but at Mercer, standing just behind him, his eyes shadowed but steady, his jacket the same one he had worn the day she had walked out of the compound and into anonymity. And Angel immediately bounded forward, tail wagging once, before she settled back into silent guard mode beside the boy's door. And Melissa didn't speak, didn't ask why they were here. She just stepped aside and let them in. And Mercer walked like a man carrying something too heavy to set down, but too vital to abandon. And once inside, once the doors were locked and the blinds pulled, he said the words she had feared and somehow expected. He wasn't working alone, and she didn't ask who. She knew. She just exhaled and nodded, motioning toward the kitchen where a kettle was already warming. And for the next hour, he told her everything. About the embedded networks, the mimic organizations, the women using false names, the training videos, the man in Phoenix, the encrypted hard drives, and the whispers of something called the Free Preservation Project, a continuation of Keller's work being run by a successor. Someone unknown, someone hidden, but someone with access to Keller's archive and his ideology. And Melissa listened without blinking, her fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped mug that had somehow become part of her identity. And when he was done, when the weight of it all had settled over the quiet house, she asked only one thing. "What do you need from me?" And Mercer's reply was softer than expected. "Not your testimony, not yet. We need your memory, your detail, your pattern recognition, the things only you can know." And she nodded. Not because she was ready, but because readiness was, a luxury long since stripped from her vocabulary. And over the next 3 days, they built a new war room in her garage, soundproofed and encrypted, where she spent hours mapping connections, revisiting files, cross-referencing dates and aliases, all while Benjamin napped in the corner beside Angel, who had resumed her post as silent sentinel. And through it all, Melissa didn't break, didn't complain, just worked like a woman trying to stitch the edges of her sanity back together, using facts, timelines, and Mercer's quiet steadiness as thread. It was on the 4th day that she saw something in one of the training logs, a name she hadn't heard in years, not Keller's, but a woman named Evelyn Frost, who had once worked as an assistant in Keller's private residence and had vanished, abruptly, rumoured to have moved overseas. And Melissa remembered her because she had been kind in small ways, a whispered warning here, an extra bottle left on a shelf there. But what stuck now was a phrase Melissa recalled her muttering once, during a storm when Keller was gone and the staff had gathered near the emergency generator. "We are not daughters here. We are echoes." And that phrase appeared now in a footnote on a digital transcript recovered by Mercer's team, a document tied to a training session titled Retention Through Reverence. And Melissa circled it with a red marker and looked at Mercer and said, "She's the one running it now," and it made sense. The precision of the new networks, the emotional language, the manipulation of grief and maternal instinct. It felt like Evelyn, or what Evelyn had become after vanishing. And Powell, when briefed, approved immediate escalation, a full cross-border investigation, surveillance assets deployed, and the location of a potential meeting scheduled to take place in Montreal between high-level operatives of the new movement. And Mercer was assigned point alongside Melissa, not as bait, but as navigator. Her knowledge was now the most powerful tool they had, and she knew it, accepted it, even as the old fear licked at her spine during the flight north. Benjamin left behind under the strictest protection measures, Angel beside her in the seat, like a weighted blanket given form and purpose. And when they landed, they moved fast, quiet, careful. And 2 nights later, they watched from an adjacent building as a woman with silver hair tied in a braid entered a warehouse flanked by 2 men in tactical black. And Melissa said, "That's her." And the operation began. What followed was precise and brutal. Drones, breach teams, signal jammers, and within minutes the room was cleared, devices seized, and Evelyn Frost sat in a folding chair inside a makeshift interrogation booth, denying nothing but admitting little, her voice calm, her posture serene, until Melissa walked in, unannounced, and the older woman's eyes widened just a fraction before narrowing. and she said, "So the ghost finally speaks." And Melissa replied, "You don't get to use my silence anymore." And what came next wasn't a shouting match or emotional breakdown. It was a dialogue of strategy, of pattern, of ethics, twisted into power. And Evelyn, cornered but composed, finally said, "Keller built the furnace. I simply kept it warm." And Mercer, listening from the next room, realized that this wasn't about one man, one trial, one victory. It was about dismantling a belief system, an entire architecture of control passed down like a relic. And when Evelyn was flown to a black site for extended debrief and the last of the warehouse's records were decrypted, they found names, hundreds, women flagged as adjustment candidates, most still alive, most unaware, and a program was born. Not a raid, not a manhunt, but a rescue operation disguised as outreach. And Melissa, without asking, signed on to help. Not in field ops, but as a designer, a translator of trauma into policy, of pain into prevention. And Mercer, now, reassigned to lead field strategy, visited often, bringing updates, coffee, and photos of Benjamin's latest drawings. Sketches of dogs and airplanes and tall figures labelled EM, which Melissa eventually admitted meant Ethan and Mom. And one night, long after curfew, they sat on her back porch watching stars blink behind clouds, and she said, "Do you ever stop being afraid?" And Mercer answered honestly, "No, you just learn which fears are worth living with." And Angel, at their feet, sighed deeply like she agreed, and the night felt warmer than it had in years. It was never really over, not in the way the movies promised, not with a gavel bang or a long exhale as the screen fades to black. In the real world, endings were soft things, fragile and fraying at the edges, more like a shift in weather than a final act. And Mercer realized this as he sat in the corner of a brightly lit community center 6 months after Evelyn Frost's arrest, watching a group of mothers and children gathered in folding chairs for a resilience workshop led by Melissa, whose voice, once quiet, once trembling, now carried across the room with a steady warmth, not loud, not rehearsed, but lived in, the way survivors speak when they've turned their pain into something practical. And he watched as Benjamin, now walking clumsily with oversized shoes and a grin too big for his face, ran toward Angel, who barked once in approval, before gently nudging him back toward his corner, and the whole room laughed. A sound Mercer hadn't realized he missed until it filled the air like clean oxygen, like a field after a storm. And in that moment, everything that had happened, the airports, the safe houses, the trial, the ghosts of Keller's empire, the sting of failure and the roar of victory, compressed into something manageable, something small enough to sit with in peace. And he let himself smile for real, just once, before standing to pour himself another cup of coffee from the cardboard dispenser on the back table, nodding at the volunteer who offered him sugar, and thinking, absurdly, about how far coffee had come from the bitter sludge he'd grown used to in the field. And behind him, Melissa finished her session with a story about strength, that it wasn't about how loud you could yell, but how many times you whispered no and still kept moving. And the room went still for a beat before filling again with quiet claps and low murmurs of thanks. And afterward, when the room emptied and the sun dipped low behind the center's high windows, casting long orange shadows on the floor, she came to stand beside him with her arms crossed loosely and said, "You remember when I told you it would never really be over?" And he nodded, thinking of the postcard, of the bear she left behind, of the late nights spent staring at court transcripts, trying to understand how some evils survived exposure. And she added, "I was wrong. It ends, just differently." And he looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the woman from the airport, or the courtroom, or the black sites, but someone rebuilt, not restored. And it moved something deep in him, something he'd been guarding too long, and he started to say something. He wasn't even sure what, but she smiled, soft and tired and perfect, and said, "We have time." And somehow that meant more than anything else. The weeks passed, and the Keller cases rippled outward, like rings in a pond. But no longer as threats. Now they were policy changes, court precedents, recovery protocols based on real experience, and Melissa became a name whispered in advocacy, circles not as a victim but as a founder, and the program they built, quietly named Sentinel, grew into something that outlived every headline and bureaucratic delay, a living network of rescue, recovery, and restoration, designed by the people who had lived it, and Mercer, though still technically attached to the federal team, found himself spending more time at the center than at his office, more time watching Benjamin learn to ride a balance bike, more time walking Angel through the park, while Melissa held a clipboard and corrected trauma vocabulary in printed handouts. And one night, while they sat on the porch of the modest house now filled with laughter, dishes in the sink, and framed sketches drawn in crayon, Mercer reached into his jacket and pulled out the original customs report from the night everything started, the night Angel broke protocol, the night Melissa begged not to be taken, the night a baby lay unknowingly atop a hidden gun, and he held it in his hands for a long while before saying, "We were supposed to process you like evidence." And she replied, "But you saw something," and he nodded. She did, glancing at Angel, who lay beside the porch door with one ear perked, eyes closed, a guardian always half awake. And then he folded the paper neatly and set it alight in the ashtray they used for citronella candles, watching it curl and vanish, and neither of them said another word, because it didn't need to be said. And when, a year later, they received a certified letter from a federal clerk informing them that Robert Keller had died in prison during a fight over stolen commissary, there was no celebration, no sigh of relief, just a quiet acknowledgement. Over breakfast, that evil doesn't always leave with thunder. It sometimes slips out with a whimper, and they didn't mourn him, but they didn't dance either. They just lived, more fully, more freely, because they could, and that was enough. In time, Mercer was officially transferred to Sentinel as Director of Field Outreach, and Melissa became Chief of Survivor Development, though titles meant less than the work, and Benjamin grew into a boy who loved puzzles, dogs, and asking questions, at full volume, and Angel slowed down, her muzzle turning grey. But she remained the quiet anchor of their home, never far from Benjamin, who insisted she sleep beside his bed every night in case the wind gets loud, and Melissa joked that he was his mother's son in more ways than one, and Mercer said, "That's the highest compliment," and life kept going, not perfectly, but honestly, and one evening, as they stood at a new facility being built in another city under the Sentinel name, Melissa leaned on the railing beside Mercer, looked at the construction crews below, and said, "Do you ever think about the girl who didn't make it out, and he didn't have to ask who? He thought of all the names on all the lists, of the ones they couldn't save, of the ones lost to silence. And he said, 'Every time we build one of these, I hope they feel it.'" And Melissa nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and said, "Then let's build another." And he smiled, thinking maybe that's what justice really was. Not courtroom wins or arrest records, but rooms like this, filled with light, staffed with survivors, echoing not with screams, but with laughter. And as the sun fell behind the construction site and the lights blinked on one by one, Mercer reached down, took Melissa's hand, not for the first time, not for the last, and said, "We already are."